Hi anyone and everyone, welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam, and today we're going to finish talking about Polly Klaas's disappearance. But before we do that, I want to talk about the recent updates in the Asha Degree case. Back in February of this year, we covered Asha's case, and recently there has been a lot of movement in it. A lot of this information is still pretty new, and I was debating on giving an update and seeing if I should just wait for more information, but I do think we have enough to at least touch on it here, and then I'll probably wait a bit longer in the hopes that more information will come forward in the future, but there's still plenty here to talk about. As of recording this, on September 26th, Asha has not been found. There's been a lot of discussion back and forth whether she has or hasn't, but the authorities have not confirmed that any remains have been found. But they do believe they know who may be involved in her disappearance, and they have now publicly stated for the first time that they do not believe Asha is alive. Asha was 9 years old when she disappeared, after it is believed that she left her house of her own free will. And in the middle of the night, she left alone during a thunderstorm, and she was terrified of thunderstorms. Eyewitnesses say that they believe that they saw Asha walking down the highway about a mile from her home. Then some items that belonged to Asha were found in a barn off of the highway, not too far from where those drivers had seen her. In addition to the items that belonged to Asha, a couple other items were found, the most baffling of which is the photo of another young girl. And to this day, we have no idea who the girl in the photo is. And then a year and a half later, after Asha disappeared, and after following many leads that didn't get authorities any closer to finding Asha, her backpack was found. The backpack was wrapped in 2 black plastic garbage bags and was buried about 30 miles from where Asha had last been seen. The backpack was found by a construction crew that was clearing some wooded land for a driveway. And the backpack itself belonged to Asha, but some of the items inside were confirmed to have belonged to her, but there were a handful of other items that her family says weren't hers, such as a New Kids on the Block long sleeve t-shirt, McElliot's Pool, a Dr. Seuss book that had actually been checked out from Asha's school library, but authorities have said that Asha was not the one who checked out that book. They've never come out to say who had checked it out or if they even knew who had checked it out. But it is very interesting that they don't believe Asha had, but it had come from her school library. And then in 2015, Asha's case was being reevaluated and investigators were going over all of the details again, and they discovered tips that had been reported around the time of Asha's disappearance that said Asha was seen getting into a 1970s green sedan. The person calling in the tip believed that the car was potentially a Thunderbird or a Lincoln Mark IV, and the car had rust on its wheels. So they also said that they believed that there were potentially 2 people in the car when Asha got into it. And that's essentially the basics of what we knew at the time of recording that episode. But earlier this month, searches were conducted on the properties owned by the Dedman family. The search warrants were issued after DNA from a hair sample that was found inside the 2 plastic garbage bags along with Asha's backpack. And the Dedman family consists of Roy and Connie and their 3 daughters, Lizzie, Sarah, and Anna Lee. From what I understand, the hair that was found belonged to Anna Lee, who would have been 13 at the time of Asha's disappearance. This does not confirm Annalee's direct involvement, but authorities believe that there's a possibility that some members within the Dedmon family may minimally know more information about what happened to Asha. During the search warrant, an older green car was taken in by authorities. This green car matches the general description released by authorities in 2015 from the tip. And the warrant also requested DNA samples from Annalee and from a man named Russell Underhill, whose DNA was also connected to items in the bags where Asha's backpack were buried. Underhill is a family friend of the Dedmons and was living on property owned by the Dedmons at the time of the kidnapping. The property he was living in was a nursing care facility, but in 2004, Underhill died. And according to the Shelby Star, the cause of death was not determined, but authorities do not believe foul play was a factor. Roy Dedmon would often send his 16-year-old daughter in a green AMC Rambler to help transport patients to the hospital. And a green AMC Rambler has many characteristics of the car that was described in the tip when Asha went missing. And when the daughter turned 16 in 1999, she was actually given that car. So that became her primary vehicle. And I'll post pictures of this car on Instagram in comparison to what Lincoln Mark IV or Thunderbird looks like. So you can kind of see potentially how those cars could be confused. And the route from the hospital to the nursing home that the 16-year-old daughter would often take, we believe would potentially go right along the same stretch of road where Asha was walking the night she disappeared. And one of the other properties that the Dedmon owned, because they do own a handful, that was also included within the search warrant, was only about 6 minutes from where Asha was spotted on the highway. And now I don't know if that's 6 minutes walking or 6 minutes driving. I think either way, it's safe to say that that's a pretty close distance to that area. And in addition to that, where her backpack was buried was pretty close to the hospital where the Dedmons would often take residents from the nursing home. And Dedmon's attorney has briefly commented, saying that the Dedmons don't know what happened to Asha, but once the information from the warrants is released, it'll be clear why the Dedmons' property was searched. And he also said, quote, "I think there will be some information in the search warrant that will sadly link a person to the circumstances of Asha's disappearance that is no longer living. And it is very possible, not saying the person that is named in the search warrant had anything to do with her disappearance, because I don't know any more than you do. But it is very possible that that person, who is no longer here, has the answers to what happened to Asha, and the answers may very well never be known." So that's a very interesting comment. And with the information that we do know, even though he is not saying it, it's understandable to infer he's talking about Underhill. And does this mean that without a shadow of a doubt that Russell Underhill and the Dedmons were involved in Asha's disappearance? No. Does it seem likely? It seems like the pieces are connecting. I do think there's the possibility. But I'm sure there's a lot of information that we do not know. I hope that information will be released soon, at least some of it. But we may not learn anything for quite a while, maybe even until an arrest might be made or a trial. Right now, none of that has happened. They've just done these searches. They've confirmed that they have this DNA, that they have connected to people. I just hope that the movement in this case means that Asha's family will have some answers soon, and the people or the person responsible have the ability to be held accountable. But at the moment, that's kind of the brief overlook of what we do know. And I hope to give another update in this case. But I think I'll wait a while until a lot more information comes forward so we can maybe dedicate a full episode to it. But let's go ahead and get back to Polly's case. Just to give a little bit of recap from part 1, Polly was 12 years old on October 1st in 1993 and having a sleepover with 2 of her friends. As the girls were getting ready for bed, a man entered the home and kidnapped Polly in front of her 2 friends. A palm print from the suspect was taken from Polly's bedroom, but investigators at that point didn't have a suspect to match it to. That is until they started putting some pieces together after a woman named Dana Jaffe had found some items on her property about 20 miles away from Polly's house that she believed could have been related to Polly's abduction. After Dana had called the police about these items, investigators learned that she previously called police late on October 1st. That night, a man named Richard Allen Davis was outside Dana's home on her rural property, and his car was stuck in a ditch. The officers who responded ran a check for active warrants, but they did not run a background check. They helped him get his car out of the ditch, and if they had run a background check, they would have learned that Davis was violating his probation, and they could have taken him into custody. One thing I read from the LA Times that I did not see when I was researching for part 1 was that the officers did search his car, but they didn't find anything. So after Dana had found a black sweater, red tights that were wound up in a ball and kind of knotted together, white strips of cloth, and an open but unused condom, and the condom's wrapper on her property, she believed that these items potentially could be related to Polly. And investigators were able to follow up with Davis and check his palm print against the one that was found in Polly's bedroom, and the palm prints matched. It was determined that the items found on Dana Jaffe's property had belonged to both Davis and to Polly. And 2 days after Dana had called the police, 57 days after Polly had gone missing, Davis was arrested for her abduction. So after Davis is arrested, no one really knew where Polly was. He still wasn't really talking. And obviously that's the first priority for investigators. A few different investigators questioned Davis, but he was very much staying quiet. Eventually, Sergeant Mike Messy sat down with Davis and he tried a new approach. While other investigators were very forward with Davis, Messy wanted to be a little softer, and that worked. Davis told Messy that he traveled to Petaluma to see his mother, and he said he didn't find his mother, but after he arrived, he ended up meeting up with a guy who was selling weed, so he bought a joint from him, and he believed that joint was laced with PCP because he doesn't fully remember what happened next. He also said that he had been drinking all day, so in combination with that, the weed, the potential PCP, his memory is pretty fuzzy, and there's some chunks of time missing. And just to note, according to crimelibrary.org and their coverage of this case, apparently as part of Davis's parole, he had to go through pretty frequent drug tests and had to do a test the day after he supposedly smoked this PCP laced joint. And it said on their coverage that his tests came back negative for drugs. So off the bat, this seems to be a lie from Davis. But this is the first thing that he told investigators. He then continued to say that he didn't remember going to Polly's home, but he did remember breaking into it. He also said he didn't know why he had kidnapped her, but that he just did. And then after kidnapping her, he drove around with her for a while she was sitting in the front seat with him, at which point they ended up on Dana Jaffe's property. He had gotten his car stuck in the mud while there, and at this point he untied Polly, began to casually walk with her to this nearby hill where he then left her. And after he left her on this hillside, he went back to his car, and this is when the police had shown up, and they felt like his excuse for being in the area of late night sightseeing was good enough to help him get his car out of the mud and let him be on his way. He said he then went back to Polly, who at this point he's just left sitting on this hill. And he says that he was lucky to find her again and, quote, "I guess it wasn't lucky for her." So he's already kind of going through this, not really showing a ton of emotion for what, at this point, investigators are believing that he had done, in which he's kind of admitting he kidnapped her. He said that she was sleeping, and just remember, he untied her, walked her up this hill, and left her there. And I don't know how long the officers were there helping get his car out of the mud, but she supposedly just stayed there. And according to him, she was curled up and just went to sleep. And when he returned, she said, quote, "I thought you left me." He then got back into his car and drove about another 30 miles or so to Cloverdale, California. He let Polly out of the car again so she could use the bathroom. But it was at this point that he strangled Polly from behind using a strip of fabric. He then tied the fabric around her neck so that he can ensure that Polly would be dead, which is terrible. But Davis said that once he made the decision to kidnap Polly, he knew that he didn't have any other option other than killing her, because if he let her go, he would end up back behind bars. So Davis decided to kill Polly, and he left her in a shallow grave covered with plywood. And after Davis explained his original story, detectives began to ask more detailed questions, starting with how he broke into the Klass home. He said he climbed through the front window and then went to the kitchen and took a knife. Eve, Polly's mom, says that there weren't any knives missing from the kitchen, so detectives doubted this story. But one thing I would like to point out, as far as I've seen, Davis doesn't mention a knife again after threatening the 3 girls in Polly's bedroom when he abducted her. Could he have possibly put the knife back on his way out with Polly? Could it have been something as simple as a butcher block on the counter? Just put it right back in as you're quickly walking by. So I'm not sure. I've just never really seen anyone talk about that. But investigators believe that it was an overall lie, how he got into the home. And instead, they believe that the back door was potentially left unlocked. And that obviously giving Davis easiest access into the home with less likelihood of being seen just climbing through a front window of the home. He also said that he had not been in Petaluma before the night he kidnapped Polly. But investigators would learn that this isn't true and that he had been seen in the area 2 months before kidnapping Polly. And that he also has family members in the area, one of which his sister, who he was staying with at the time. When asked if Davis had molested or raped Polly, he denied it. When they circled back to the topic, Davis said that he didn't remember, but he doesn't think that he did. And when they circled back yet again, he said that he doesn't remember and that when they do Polly's autopsy, they'll be able to see if he had or hadn't. And then at one point, circling back again, he swore on his own skin that he didn't do anything sexual to her. So he's very inconsistent with his statements. Within a couple of days of Davis's arrest on December 4th, he led investigators to Cloverdale, to the spot where he left Polly. And Polly's remains were decomposing, and investigators were unfortunately unable to determine if he had sexually assaulted her. And due to that fact, they were only able to charge him with first-degree murder with special circumstances. In California, murder with special circumstances is essentially combining a couple charges, from my understanding. Special circumstances, in his case, refers to the kidnapping. But since special circumstances itself is a fairly vague statement, they also are going to try to argue that sexual assault falls under that umbrella so that they can bring it up in the trial without having a specific sexual assault charge and it having been more circumstantial evidence. For example, the condom, even though it was unused, it was still found amongst the things that put him and Polly kind of together, the items found on Dana Jaffe's property. And if found guilty of murder with special circumstances, the sentence is life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. And if he had only been charged with first-degree murder, it's a minimum of 25 years. So clearly, due to the severity of the crime, in addition to the fact that Davis is a repeat offender, prosecutors really wanted to make sure that Davis would not have the ability to be released or harm anyone else in the future. The trial was very emotional. The prosecutors asked multiple members of Polly's family to take the stand so that they could help the jury understand the impact of Polly's death. Mark, Polly's father, broke down in tears. He explained that everything reminds him of Polly, and that he just can't concentrate or sleep or really do anything without thinking about her. And Polly's grandfather explained that her murder was worse than his time in the army during World War II. He said that he was able to come home from war, even though he saw and went through terrible and life-changing things. He was able to come home. And Polly will never come home again. The prosecution rested their case with expert testimony from psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz. And Dr. Dietz said that in his expert opinion, he believes that Davis potentially stalked Polly before her abduction. And Dr. Dietz was unable to examine Davis as he would with a typical patient. But based on Davis's past behavior and actions, Dr. Dietz says he has paraphilic behavior. And paraphilic behavior is described as, quote, persistent and recurrent sexual interests, urges, fantasies, or behaviors of marked intensity involving objects, activities, or even situations that are atypical in nature. Essentially, Dr. Dietz is saying that Davis had an urge to kidnap Polly for his own sexual gratification, and part of his process specifically involved involuntarily tying Polly up. The prosecution wanted to make sure that the jury didn't forget that they believed that Polly's kidnapping and murder were premeditated and part of a pattern on Davis's past criminal history, which we discussed quite a bit in part 1. While the prosecution took the emotional route, Davis's defense fully admitted that Davis killed Polly, but not under the special circumstances that warrant life in prison without parole or the death penalty. Instead, Polly's murder was a result of a robbery gone wrong And it had all gone wrong because of Davis's mental state at the time. And the jury didn't agree with the defense, and Davis was sentenced to death on June of 1996. As the jury read out Davis's conviction, he decided to give the courtroom the middle finger, showing absolutely zero remorse for what he had done. And then during his sentencing, Davis was allowed to address the court. In his statement, he said something that truly shocked the court and everyone that was observing the case. Davis stood by his statements, saying that he did not sexually assault Polly. He said, quote, "The main reason I know I did not attempt any lewd act that night was because the statement the young girl made to me while walking up the embankment. Just don't do me like my dad." Which was implying that Mark Klass had been sexually molesting or raping his daughter before Davis had kidnapped and murdered her. At this point, Mark stood up in the courtroom and screamed, "Burn in hell, Davis." And he lunged towards him. Officers grabbed him and pulled him out of the courtroom because obviously he's understandably incredibly emotional. And as things began to calm down a little bit, the judge was reading his sentencing. And the judge commented saying that it was very easy to give him the death penalty, especially with how he acted during his statement. Mark Klaas returned to the courtroom to listen to the sentencing. And as the sentencing was being read, he threw his fist into the air as a victorious celebration. Well, Davis took so much from Mark and Mark's family. He felt that this was the best justice the court system could offer. He would go on to say, quote, "The last thing Polly saw before she died was Richard Allen Davis's eyes. The last thing Richard Allen Davis will see is my eyes, I hope." Quickly after the sentencing, prosecutors would publicly denounce Davis's statements that Mark had sexually molested Polly and would be clear in saying that there was zero evidence that supported Davis's claims. So at this point, I kind of want to backtrack a little bit, and I want to discuss some controversies within this case now that you know the overarching details. One of the biggest controversial conversations in this case, which I've already touched on a little bit, was the incident where Davis's car was stuck on Dana Jaffe's property and she had called the police. If the officers had done a background check during that trespassing call, they could have potentially saved Polly's life. According to Davis, she was alive and sitting in the woods not too far from where the police were talking to Davis. In addition to the officers running the background check, they were just also unaware that a young girl had been kidnapped about 20 miles away. Well, some departments were informed and some areas had a news broadcast on local radio stations pretty quickly after the kidnapping with a description of Davis. The officers who responded to that call had no clue they were looking for a man with Davis's description. And Dana had not heard about the kidnapping that evening because it wasn't broadcast in her area, despite being within this reasonable distance of someone traveling after the kidnapping. Another conversation that is brought up in this case, and unfortunately many, many, many other cases, is that Davis had so many prior arrests for violent crimes, including 2 separate kidnapping attempts. How was he allowed to be released and try to kidnap more people again? And Mark Klaas partnered up with a man named Mike Reynolds, whose daughter, Kimber Reynolds, was murdered in 1922. Kimber was shot by a man who was a career criminal. And even after her murder, he was eventually released and committed more violent crimes. And in the article I was reading, it said that he really only was out of prison a maximum of 2 years at a time for decades after that. Mark and Mike pushed for a new California law called the Three Strikes Law. It is essentially as it sounds. After 3 felony convictions, there is a mandatory life sentence in prison. And in the state of California, that is a minimum of 25 years. Also, with this law, after the second offense, the sentence is doubled. So, first sentence is the normal sentencing for the first offense. The second offense, the sentencing is automatically doubled. And then for the third, there is a minimum of the 25 years. According to Stanford Law, there's definitely issues with this. According to their website, they say more than half of the inmates in California who fall under the Three Strikes Law did not commit violent crimes because there's this umbrella of felony convictions, which is a large variety of crime. And the law intended to help keep men like Richard Allen Davis off the streets after he shows that he had repeatedly committed violent crimes. He was arrested numerous times, 2 attempted kidnappings before Polly. And with that pattern, he likely will not stop based on his criminal history. But the law was not specific enough. People who were arrested for fairly minor infractions, still felonies, but in comparison, minor. And if they had repeat felonies, then their sentence is doubled. If that happened a third time, it's a minimum of 25 years. And Stanford Law provides an example of someone breaking into a soup kitchen, receiving the same sort of sentencing. Obviously, you shouldn't be breaking into a soup kitchen, but it's not on the same level as murdering a 12-year-old girl after he had attempted to kidnap 2 women previously. I've seen many articles discussing proposals for amendments to the law to define felony convictions a little more clearly, to be specifically violent, or to even remove the law completely. It doesn't look like it's on the ballot in California at this time, but over the years I've seen numerous articles on how Californians would like to minimally change the law to be defined for violent crime. But Mark Klass was not done after the 3 strikes law was implemented. He wanted to try to help as many families as possible whose children were victims of violent crime. So he started the Polly Klaas Foundation, which we previously mentioned in part 1. Initially, it started as a way to raise money for Polly's search specifically. And after she was found, Mark wanted to try to help other families fund their searches and give them the resources that they need in this tragic and desperate time for them. They have a 24-hour hotline for parents or guardians through what I'm sure feels like an absolutely impossible situation. They have somebody contact to talk about it. They provide counseling for parents and families. They give advice on the best way to search for missing children. They also accept tips that they report directly to the police. And they have a network of volunteer teams that will also help physically search if they're in that area. They also want to try to help families before a child goes missing by providing preventative information. They also have child safety kits. I'll link the website in our description because they offer so much to be able to help families who need it. And Mark also started Klass Kids, which, according to their website, they will unfortunately be closing at the end of 2024. But Klass Kids helps families fairly similarly to the Polly Klaas Foundation, But with the way he structured the class, the way he structured Klass Kids, he has more ability to push politically to get policies changed so that there's more resources within the government and within the laws to help protect families and help provide resources if something like this happens to another family. And with the way that the Polly Klaas Foundation is set up as a nonprofit, they are unable to do that. So he wanted another avenue to be able to do this and hopefully have some impact within the government as well. And really, that's kind of all I have on Polly's case. I will say Richard Allen Davis is still on death row. To this day, he is on death row. He had attempted an appeal that was denied. And I haven't seen if there's a specific date for his execution. It doesn't look like it. But that is really all that I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you so much for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also find us on Spotify and leave a review there. You can find us on YouTube at Have You Heard About This Case, on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, on TikTok at HYHATC, or you can email us at haveyouheardaboutthiscase@gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.